I was thinking we could talk about using the Jupyter Notebook in an educational context. And in particular, one thing that I've been thinking about is like how to use it in particular for more like cognitive science or psychology type classes. And so I thought that would be an interesting thing to talk about, given that you're in a cognitive science department too.
Right, and so are you.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that domain specifically, and how is that different than, say, a computer science class?
Usually the way that I hear people talking about like teaching, computer science concepts usually is, either in the context of specifically a computer science class, or they're talking about it more in terms of like data science in the social sciences, or for, like you also hear people talking about it in terms of like biology and physics, but every single field kind of has its own flavor of like the types of things that need to be accomplished with like computer skills. So one thing that I find in cognitive science and psychology that is really crucial, or increasingly crucial, is the ability to develop web-based experiments and then run those on like Mechanical Turk or whatever. But the type of coding skills that you might pick up from taking a class in MATLAB is totally different from the type of JavaScript skills that you might need to be able to deploy your experiment on Mechanical Turk. Some like data science classes might teach those types of skills in the context of maybe like web scraping or stuff like that, but it is a different set of skills. But then that's still only one part of the picture. You do still also need the skills in order to like analyze the data and do your statistics, create your graphs, etc. So it kind of is, there's a wide diversity of skills that are really useful for cognitive science that a lot of times, at least out of the courses that I've seen, usually like only like a subset of those skills are addressed at any one given time.
It's real interesting. I mean, because the data, the data analysis, even data scraping stuff seems more broadly applicable to many fields, right? Economics, all these people need that. But actually what you mentioned about the being able to make web-based experiments where, we have a condition, we have you click on stuff, we log some data, and then we make a nice web front end or whatever. So we put on Mechanical Turk, post some tasks, and make it appealing so people actually want to do it. Yeah, that seems pretty. That seems like something that's totally not addressed. I mean, I never actually thought about that. And I mean, does that have to do with the Jupyter Notebook, or is this a separate issue that we need to teach people how to make JavaScript web app survey things?
So I think that the web scripting part is like, it's not as closely tied to the Jupyter Notebook, but I think you could potentially teach, I haven't like done this, but I've been thinking about it a little bit. You could potentially teach people like at least sort of the basics in terms of what you might need to do to create a web-based experiment through the Jupyter Notebook. Because the notebook is itself a web app, that means that you can like natively execute JavaScript in the notebook. And so you could potentially like get people to start building kind of like simple interfaces in the notebook, and then once you've gotten them comfortable with that, maybe start building it out to more complex things as well, that are not necessarily in the notebook itself. But I think it certainly requires like a different way of thinking about things in terms of the sort of traditional like imperative programming approach, where you write one line of code and everything happens in serial, and you don't have to worry about like stuff executing at the same time, which is where like a lot of the JavaScript bugs come in from. But maybe having people like create UIs in the notebook, or in a language that they're familiar with, at least could get them comfortable with that way of thinking before you migrate them to an entirely new programming language.
And like you mentioned, because the notebook is all web-based, you could just imagine a special mode where you have JavaScript blocks, and those JavaScript blocks just, you have a widget library that's, jQuery UI or whatever, that's pre-imported, and then those JavaScript blocks, it runs, and then below it actually pops up the little widget thing, because they're already widgets. So it pops up widget things that you can prototype, and then when you click on a widget, it will like display the data it's logging. And you could imagine and having that be a deployable experimental survey thing, in some hypothetical world.
Yeah, I think it would be a little bit harder to deploy the notebook itself, especially with a like to have it I guess it depends on how exactly you're deploying it. If you make it be like a link on your website or something that you could have people just navigate to, then that might work a little bit better. To have it interface specifically with Mechanical Turk, there's like a lot of moving pieces where you have to like, you know, get the ID of the worker and get the ID of the assignment that they're doing. And then at the end of the assignment, when they're finished doing the task, well, there's different ways that you can do it. So there's definitely like tools out there that try to make it easier to make Mechanical Turk experiments. So the package that I use is called SciTurk. That's developed by some people at NYU. There's also a tool being developed in my lab, Tom Griffith's lab, called Dallinger. It was previously called Wallace, and that's it's a tool for building incredibly like complex Mechanical Turk experiments. So there's this paradigm called iterated learning, which is it's sort of like the game of telephone, where you know you pass one piece of information to someone, and then they take that same piece of information and pass it along to the next person. But in the process, it kind of gets corrupted, and so you end up with something totally different at the end of the chain than what you maybe started with. And you can think of that sort of paradigm in an even more generalized setting where you don't just necessarily have like a single chain, but you have a whole graph, and every person in the experiment is a node in that graph, and then you can have whatever graph structure you want. So Dallinger is a way of building those experiments on Mechanical Turk, but and so these sorts of like packages make it easier to interface with Turk. But I think a big challenge is still understanding how to kind of design the web interfaces in the first place, and you know, like understanding what are like the common pitfalls, like you know, the asynchronous stuff that I mentioned. And also there's sort of like this weird, like almost like ethical part to it too, which is like when you're running these experiments with like real people who are on the other end of the computer, you really like want to make sure that, like, especially in that type of context, that your experiment doesn't have bugs in it that are going to like cause the experiment to crash and then cause those people to. Mechanical Turk doesn't really have a very good way of resolving like those sorts of things. So usually what happens if your experiment crashes, then people will just what's called return the hit, which means they like abandon the assignment and then go do something else. But then that means that you've wasted their time because they, you know, spent 5-10 minutes on your assignment. So there's all these sorts of like, yeah, like issues that you have to kind of take into account. And it's like, you know, it's important to be able to like, you know, develop applications and write code that's, you know, mostly bug-free in any context, but in this context, it's like particularly important, I think.
Yeah, this is actually really fascinating. I mean, this is why I love doing these podcasts, because it takes me in unexpected directions. Because I was expecting to talk about the traditional Python, we analyze data, we make scrapes and data, but you actually got into this thing which I call kind of web programming for scientists, which I've never really heard formalized before, but it makes so much sense. Is that, imagine if you are a psychology undergrad or an economics, behavioral economics undergrad or psychology undergrad, and then you go and you do your PhD in a cutting edge field like this, you are really both a data scientist and a web programmer, and a person who's munging around Mechanical Turk. I mean, if you're an NYU, like at the Stern School, you're doing Mechanical Turk experiments on behavioral economics, and you folks are doing as well. And it's like, if you think about the day-to-day life of a grad student who was a psychology undergrad, doing psychology stuff, they are basically a web programmer, data scientist, Mechanical Turk bugs, and thinking about data ethics and stuff all day. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. It really like kind of requires like a new, different set of skills than people have like traditionally focused on, for sure. I was going to say something and the thought slipped my mind now. See if it'll come back to me. Oh yeah, right. One thing I was going to mention is that, there are also like a lot of like web survey type paradigms out there, which like a lot of people can get by with. Like it depends kind of on the types of experiments that you want to run. So if you just want people to like, look at pictures and say like, give some rating on a Likert scale and say like, like how good of an example is this of a cat or something like that, or like which of these images makes you like more like excited, or these sort of like traditional type psychology experiments where you can easily give these kind of more like survey based ratings. There's all sorts of like platforms like Qualtrics and stuff like that will allow you to do those, and those don't really require too much web programming knowledge. But to really like start, the web is really cool because it offers us this ability to create much more complex and interesting experiments that go way beyond just rating an image or reading something and providing like a free response. You can get all sorts of like interesting behavior out of that. But with being able to do that, requires like a much higher set of skills. So I guess like one thing that I've been trying to think about is like how could you best teach people, like how could you provide them a introduction to these type of computing skills that's going to both serve, it's going to both be useful for them to then like transfer that knowledge to learn specifically about the data science applications, and one in which it's going to transfer to building these types of web applications. So maybe it's something like like what we were just talking about with having them do it in the notebook, and then with the widgets, and you can see what data the widgets is saving out, and then you could have them, you could like construct these assignments where you have them like immediately take that data that they're collecting right there, and now start doing some analysis on it. Maybe like by combining it in that way, it's not that you're teaching them one thing and then they generalize it to two things, but you're teaching them two things simultaneously.
My stack just overflowed. You said a lot of really good stuff. So I was like, I have like 5 questions, and I'm like, in my head. I'm also getting older, so I like can't remember stuff. But
I'm sorry.
I
think go ahead. Yeah.
You hit out a few really good points. One of them is now I forgot. No, this thing on the stack, because I remember that. I think this end-to-end experience is really key, right? This thing you just said of about for my students, what we do in human-computer interaction research is really we make web-based systems, interactive web-based systems, and we deploy them online or have user studies, and then we collect data and then we analyze the data. So in terms of a really practical skill set for students, for grad students that I want to work with, they need to be able to do this end-to-end, right? So I mean, I don't like making an interview question or whatever, but really it's if someone can say some widget or app or something to do something, right? Maybe a survey app or a something that's non-trivial. They can put it on the web. They know how to host it and deploy it. Then they know how to write some logging code so that when users interact with it, it logs some data. Then they know how to take that data, parse it, run some statistics, and then maybe make like a D3 interactive visualization at the end, so that they go from the app itself to deployment to collecting logging data to analyzing the data to making some diagrams out of it. It doesn't have to be very complicated, but if someone has that end-to-end pipeline, which requires web programming and deployment and Python data munging and some D3 visualization stuff, that's really the basic skill set. And from then we can build more sophisticated stuff. And the other point that I just remembered was this thing you were saying about how Trix or Google Forms or just kind of standard widgets to put together surveys. That's sort of analogous to data science, right? Like there are a bunch of people who can get by with basic Excel. I mean, then there are people who are really good at Excel, and then after a certain point, you have to be doing R or Python and stuff if you want to scrape data and interface with the database and everything. And from a practical perspective, as an experimentalist, just strategy-wise, if you're able to customize and build your own, like you said, more sophisticated, more creative experiments with custom web experiences, you're just able to kind of explore the frontier of research a bit more than other groups who are limited in their programming abilities, and they can only make A/B tests of images or whatever, because then you're not competing with 50 paper submissions of A/B tests of images. You're actually making a more creative kind of iterative experience and stuff. And this is sort of, as a technology person, this is the kind of technology leverage you get to science. That this is why I encourage people to learn programming, because if you don't, then you can only run the qualitative surveys, and it prevents you from doing the other kinds of research that you could be doing.
Yeah, totally. I think another related domain to that too is, and it's not one that I've explored, there's people in our lab doing some stuff with this, but is things like smartphone apps or iPad apps or those types of things too, where it's similar to the idea of like constructing these web experiments, because you can do you can have a totally different type of interactivity and like build really interesting like complex tasks for people to do. And the benefit of having them be like smartphone things is that people are probably doing them just, like while they're on the train. So they're in, a more naturalistic environment. I mean, the app itself might not necessarily be a natural task, but you're at least, there's always like the risk of having, like various like experimenter demand effects by having people come into the lab and they feel like they're like in a experiment or whatever, right? So but that's not even something I've explored, but it would be very interesting to explore that too. But it would be so cool to start seeing like more like psychology and cog sci programs offering undergrad classes in like, here's how you build a web experiment, or here's how you would build a smartphone experiment, or and teaching them how to not just build the experiment, but do the whole pipeline, like you said, from building it and then doing the data collection and analyzing it at the end. It seems like a lot though to expect, I guess, like there's definitely a trade-off though in terms of like how much time I guess you expect like undergrads to be able to reasonably spend on like the prerequisites. Like to be able to really do that whole pipeline, requires probably more than like a semester of programming experience.
Definitely. Yeah, it requires a lot. Yeah. So I guess shifting gears slightly, from the education part to the kind of the software development part. I mean, what has been your experience in your lab and stuff with kind of balancing this good software, right? Good enough software for your work and, actually getting the science done and stuff? Because this is always a big issue in computational labs.
Yeah. It's definitely a really hard trade-off. I think, our lab in particular, I think everyone kind of finds their own balance there. So for me specifically, I tend to be like the sort of person that I really like to explore like different computational tools and different ways of doing things. And in doing so, I tend to like end up doing more like, for example, like test-driven development and stuff like that. But that's partially because I kind of like to do that. I think it's really hard, especially to motivate yourself to do that if it's not something that you kind of like intrinsically like to do. And I see people don't necessarily do that, and it's because they're like, trying to like finish something for a deadline, and that trade-off, especially coming up to deadlines, is really hard, I think, because you could spend the time to, like kind of develop things in like the right way, but then that's going to take the valuable time that you need to actually get your results and get the paper written up and all of that. And you can say like sometimes, a lot of people will try to argue like, oh, if you just do like do the development the right way in the first place, it's going to save you a lot of time in the long run. But I don't know. I think in my experience, that's not always actually true. I think, in 90% of, maybe 90% of the time, you do things like well enough that, everything ends up working out in the end. And it's like the 10% of cases where if you had done it like, right the first place, it would have saved you a lot of time. And if you, I think start your graduate career and you start doing that and you get practice doing that, then by the time you're at the end of your graduate career, it's really easy. Or maybe easy is not the right term, but it's like, there's not a lot of overhead to saying, okay, I'm just going to like write a few tests really quick to check this code or whatever. But if you, like start doing it like at the end of your grad career. Now all of a sudden it takes a lot of time. So I think that was kind of it just went all over the place with it. But to maybe sort of summarize my thoughts, I think the more you can, I think, get people to start engaging in like good development practices early on in their PhD, the better, because it's like, it does require a lot of practice to get comfortable with it and to be able to do it easily. So it's not really a lot of overhead. And just in terms of like building up, a set of like utilities for yourself or for the lab. Our lab tends to not share that much code, but I think that's changing now as more people are starting to like tackle the same types of problems, like setting up a mechanical Turk experiment, for example. And so there's definitely a trade-off with that, like how much time you actually spend like trying to do the development versus just like push through and get as much done as you can.
Yeah, it is a hard balance. Like you mentioned, it's not always good to over optimize early too, because things change, right? And things in science change a lot. And but what you mentioned about the people with good habits early on, I think is really key. And that's kind of akin to like in traditional lab sciences, right? I mean, the apprenticeship is you have to like know how to get all your pipettes. Volunteer in a bio lab, like when I was in high school, for I think 2 summers, and just doing very mechanical, bio stuff. That's when I realized I didn't want to do physical sciences at all. I was just like, doing all the pipetting and all the DNA, whatever things. And like you get trained in these habits, because if you don't do that, you actually cross-contaminate, or it's like the bacteria cross-contaminates to the thing and your whole like petri dish is ruined. So although it is kind of rote, like people get trained in these really, really set habits, because otherwise you'll get, something will get bad later on in the pipeline. So, and one of the issues is that software hasn't become a first-class thing in a lot of sciences yet. And I think it needs to, right? That if we treat software like we treat the, lasers or whatever, because they're $1 million lasers, and you don't want to get the lens dirty because, something will go, you'll throw off everyone's experiments, or like the, Large Hadron Collider. You don't want to misalign something because it'll blow up, right? If we treat software like that as habits, then, and things like software carpentry is helping with that. But I think a hard challenge with that is, especially like we mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, for people who came in without a strong programming or computer science background, they're struggling enough to learn the basic programming.
It's really overwhelming.
Data management, software carpentry stuff, as well as the programming, is really, really hard. I think it's just a big challenge.
And things like, as like someone who is a developer of the tools that people use in this ecosystem, I'm like really sympathetic to it. It's very hard to solve a lot of the like overhead problems in terms of like for example, if you are collaborating on a project with someone and you're using notebooks, and now you both edit the notebook, and now like you have a merge conflict. And I mean, there's like tools to help with that, but like if you don't know about the tools, then you're just like, oh my God, like a merge conflict is scary enough on its own, and now it's like in JSON, like how do I like possibly resolve this, right? And so I'm really sympathetic to like how hard it is to resolve those problems from the developer standpoint, but I'm also really sympathetic to like people coming in who haven't had to deal with this whole like ecosystem of infrastructure, and it's just very overwhelming to kind of get used to using all of that. And so I wish that there was like, I mean, I think software carpentry is definitely like has been like really successful at helping people get immersed in that ecosystem. But even that, I think, is still, even if you like learn how to do like resolve a merge conflict in software carpentry, the first time you actually like encounter one in the wild, it's still like it's a scary experience, and you're like, I don't remember what to do, and like and so you end up like a lot of the time it doesn't get like handled properly, and then you have like the the little angle brackets like it's littered all over the code everywhere.
And then it breaks your rendering, right?
Yeah.
Probably. Yeah. I think it's scary too, because it's people's real data and code, right? It's like you've been writing this, hacky MATLAB thing for days with all the stuff copy pasted, and then something goes wrong in your file system, or like something overwrites a file, or there's a merge conflict, and then you panic because this is your real stuff. It's not like an exercise that you're just doing in a class with some fake data.
Yeah. And I think, it's particularly hard to encourage like other, like, so in my lab, at least, like if people, I always tell like everyone, like, if you have problems with Git, like feel free to like ask me, because I've been using Git for like, I don't know, like 8 years or something at this point. And like I've dealt with like all manner of likes and whatever. I always tell people, like, if something goes, like, you can still get your changes back even if it seems like you can't, and like, let me know, I can try to help. But not every lab has like someone who's been using Git for 8 years. If like, someone in the lab is like, oh, like, I was told I should like start using Git. Well, maybe they're the Git expert in the lab, but if they've only been using it for, a few months, like they're probably not going to know how to like resolve some of the really hairy stuff that can occasionally come up. So, and then, yeah, because people are dealing with like, the stuff that they've really been like, pouring all of their time into, the thought of potentially like losing that because you don't know how to use this weird piece of software is, it's like very terrifying.
And there's several thoughts. I mean, one is I always encourage everyone to just like put all your stuff in Dropbox, right? So there are things like, just having stuff in Dropbox is nice because it's all versioned behind the scenes, so that, it's within, I think the free account has 30-day history or something, but like that's the sort of thing, I mean, just thinking about system design too, that's the sort of thing you can just forget about, as a base layer. I mean, you shouldn't just use Dropbox as version control because it doesn't have all the stuff Git has, but I've seen people just edit their files on their computer with no backups whatsoever, right? And like something crashes on their computer and stuff, or something gets corrupted and overwritten. But so nice thing about things like Dropbox is that you don't have to think about it, and it does the versioning for you. And the other thing you mentioned is, I think computational knowledge is really the way things get done now. So you're in a lab, you have someone like yourself or some other person who knows about X or Y, then they kind of come up to you and bug you for help and stuff. And that's good and bad, right? It's disrupted, and it's uneven. Knowledge is really uneven and spiky in different places. People graduate and come and leave. I mean, this is one of the things that industry has this huge advantage of. So I worked at Google for a while, and industry, there's just this huge institutional knowledge base of people who are experts in various things. There are internal help forums, there's all this stuff. Whereas in academia, especially in more science labs, you have to rely on people such as yourself as subject matter experts on here or that, or maybe someone in another lab knew this, but their knowledge is 5 years old because because like everyone is just incidentally as part of their job, but it's such a primary part that it's hard to scale this up. And then people have to learn how to ask for help and pose the right questions and search on Stack Overflow and learn how to filter all the answers they get and stuff. And thinking about it gives me a headache.
The sort of like institutional knowledge is a big one. I did an internship at DeepMind this summer, so I also am familiar with like all of the massive knowledge that Google has, and we as a lab, we've been trying to like set up like a lab wiki that has some knowledge, but it's so hard to maintain that because just like people's knowledge can get 5 years out of date, the wiki knowledge can get 5 years out of date, just like that. And no one really notices. Never get updated.
It's a good like history of what happened 10 years ago,
right? Maybe someone creates a tool once and then like says like uploads it to GitHub and is like, here lab, here's my tool that I created, maybe it's useful, but then like they forget about it, and then you have code rot, and now it's like less useful because, or maybe anti-useful because it's now leading people in the wrong direction because there's new, better things available or whatever. So it's very hard to track all that.
There are so many challenges. Last 2 minutes before we go offline and chat more, we can wrap up by I guess, what are your thoughts on if you could design like your dream experience for let's go back to the early cases. Someone who came up as an undergrad in a field without much strong programming training, and then they want to do a PhD in a heavily computational science field. How would you imagine their training pipeline in your ideal world, both in courses and lab training and everything?
Right.
If you could, design it all from scratch, what would you do?
That's a tough question. I think so. I'll give the answer for cognitive science because, like I said, I think it really differs depending on the field and the type of training that you need to do well in the field. Really, I mean, you can get the experience you need just from taking whatever computer science courses, but it's not going to be as effective as targeted training within the field. So for cognitive science, what I would say is probably having some sort of intro statsy programming class that kind of gives people an introduction to programming concepts like for loops and if statements, but in the context of something that they can understand, which is the type of psychological data that they want to be exploring. And that would be a first intro course. And then there would be a second course, which is, okay, given that you have this, sort of introductory knowledge, now let's start building on it and building more complex things. And so, having people maybe not necessarily getting to the full stage of UI design yet, but having people go and collect their own data, put it in a CSV file, and then, do some more sophisticated, modeling or analysis on top of that. I guess maybe it could even be to some extent. I don't want it to overlap too much with the first version of the class, which is also about data analysis. So I guess it maybe a better thing to do for this the second thing would either be to have an emphasis on things like building experiments and building UIs, or an emphasis on modeling and running simulations. And both would be pretty intensive in terms of coding, but in different ways. But they would also both be full, you start with the experiment and you collect the data and you do some basic analysis on it, or you start with some data that you've collected or that has been collected by someone else, and you construct a model and simulations, and then again you do some analysis on top of it. So in both cases, it would be sort of a significant step up from what they've seen before. But I think without keeping it in the realm of the types of things that the students care about and the types of things that they can understand and see how it connects to their own research, people just won't really get the why it's useful for them. So that's
cool.
That's how I would, I guess that's two courses. And
there's a lot more probably.
Yeah, I mean, you could keep building on top of that more and more. Here's you could have a course on now. Okay, here's how you build not just a simple web experiment, but here's how you could go and do also create basically what's a game, or create a smartphone app or something like that, and then things that maybe get more in the realm of machine learning. Here's how you do not just a little bit of kind of basic modeling, but how you could build your own machine learning algorithms, and what are the design decisions you have to think about when you're doing that, and those sorts of things. But yeah, at some point it gets into the realm of you kind of just have to pick that knowledge up as you go along. But there certainly is a lot that could be taught that isn't taught right now, I think.
Yeah, it's a balance of how many courses to have, right? Because a lot of the stuff, like you said, maybe the courses lay the foundations, and a lot of it you do have to learn in lab, and maybe different formats than courses are good. Maybe these small boot camp things, or these weekend seminars, or just detailed training with someone in your lab with that knowledge is good. Yeah, it is really hard because, right now people have some intro classes in computational science and stuff. And then if they want to learn, say, machine learning, they're taking the CS machine learning class, which is more theory-based, or more it's they're taking, a lot of people are taking CS courses to fill in these gaps. And the CS course is programming in Java, object-oriented programming in Java is probably not super relevant to what you have to do in science, but you have to learn about all this Java cruft and stuff. And people are picking off courses piecemeal, machine learning, algorithms and stuff, and it's not really fitting in together, but it's super complicated. So anyways, we should go offline and talk more, but thank you so much, Jess, for
thank you so much for having me.